The Birth and Rise of Canada, a Northern Saga. In the vast expanse of the Northern Hemisphere, where ancient rock meets endless forests and pristine waters, lies a nation forged in adversity and built on compromise. Canada's story begins not with a bang of revolution, but with the quiet determination of diverse peoples learning to share a challenging land. From the earliest Indigenous civilizations that thrived for millennia to the complex multicultural society of today, this is a narrative of continuous evolution, of finding strength in diversity and of building a distinct identity in the shadow of empires. Picture the world as it was 14,000 years ago. Great ice sheets retreating, revealing a land rich in resources and potential. The first peoples arrive, adapting to every ecosystem from the frozen Arctic to the temperate rainforests. They developed sophisticated societies, complex trade networks, and spiritual traditions deeply connected to the land. Then come the Europeans. First, the Vikings, then the fishermen, followed by explorers seeking passage to the Orient. French and British empires collide on these shores, their rivalry shaping the continent's destiny. But Canada's true character emerges not from conquest, but from negotiation. It's the story of French and English learning to coexist, of Indigenous peoples resisting assimilation, of immigrants from around the world adding new threads to the national fabric. Through Confederation, 2 world wars, the quiet revolution, and the ongoing journey of reconciliation, Canada has continually redefined itself while holding to core values of peace, order, and good government. This is the epic tale of how a collection of British colonies transformed into a confident, independent nation. A country that has learned to thrive in one of the most challenging environments, that has made diversity its strength, and that continues to navigate the complex relationship between regional identity and national unity. Join us as we explore the birth and rise of Canada, a nation still becoming, still evolving, and still writing its unique story on the northern landscape.
Ancient foundations. Indigenous civilization before contact. The true beginning of Canada's story lies in the deep time of Indigenous civilization, a history spanning thousands of years before European contact. Archaeological evidence from sites like Bluefish Caves in Yukon suggests human presence dating back 24,000 years, while the Debert site in Nova Scotia confirms occupation 13,000 years ago. These first peoples weren't mere survivors in a harsh landscape. They were sophisticated societies that developed complex cultures perfectly adapted to their environments. In the Pacific Northwest, the Haida, Tlingit, Tsimshian, and Kwakwakwakwak peoples created what anthropologists consider one of the most complex hunter-gatherer societies in human history. Their villages featured massive cedar plank longhouses facing the sea, with elaborately carved totem poles recounting family histories and spiritual beliefs. The potlatch ceremony, a complex system of feasting, gift-giving, and performance, served as the foundation of social, economic, and political life. Through potlatches, wealth was redistributed, status affirmed, and history recorded. The coastal peoples mastered marine technology, building seagoing canoes from single cedar logs that could carry 50 people across open ocean. They developed sustainable harvesting practices that maintained abundant salmon runs for millennia, using fish weirs, traps, and nets that demonstrated profound ecological understanding. In the interior plateau cultures, including the Secwepemc, Nlhapamuk, and Okanagan peoples, developed semi-nomadic lifestyles following seasonal resources. They perfected the technology of fishing, creating elaborate dip nets, spears, and traps suited to different river conditions. The annual salmon runs dictated their calendar, with different species arriving at various times, creating a reliable food source that supported permanent winter villages. Their knowledge of plants was equally sophisticated. They used over 200 different plant species for food, medicine, and materials. The bitterroot, camas bulb, and various berries formed essential parts of their diet, harvested at precise times and processed using methods passed down through generations. In the Great Plains, the Blackfoot Confederacy, Cree, Assiniboine, and Nakota nations followed the massive bison herds that numbered in the tens of millions. Before horses arrived with Europeans, they developed ingenious hunting techniques, including buffalo jumps like head smashed in Alberta, where entire herds were carefully directed over cliffs. The knowledge required for these hunts was immense, understanding bison behavior, wind patterns, and topography. Every part of the animal was used: meat dried as pemmican for winter, hides for clothing and teepee covers, bones for tools, sinew for thread, and even stomach contents for medicine. The pemmican they developed, a mixture of dried meat, fat, and berries, was so nutritionally complete it would later become the staple food for European fur traders. In the eastern woodlands was the home of the Iroquoian-speaking peoples, including the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy and Wendat or Huron. They established semi-permanent villages surrounded by extensive agricultural fields. Their Three Sisters agricultural system, corn, beans, and squash planted together, represented a brilliant understanding of companion planting. The corn provided structure for the beans to climb, the beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, and the squash leaves shaded the ground, retaining moisture and suppressing weeds. This system produced more food per acre than European agriculture of the same period. Their longhouse dwellings, some stretching 100 meters, housed multiple families in matrilineal clans where women held significant political and economic power. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, formed between 1142 and 1450 according to recent research, established one of the world's oldest participatory democracies. The Great Law of Peace created a system of checks and balances between the 5, later 6 nations: Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. Decisions required consensus, and power was carefully distributed to prevent domination by any single group. This system would later influence American democratic thought, though this contribution was rarely acknowledged. In the harsh Arctic environment, the Inuit developed one of the most remarkable adaptations in human history. Their technology included the kajak or kayak, a lightweight covered boat perfect for hunting sea mammals, and the umiak, a larger open boat for transporting families and goods. They perfected the igloo, which could be built in hours using only snow knives, providing shelter in temperatures reaching -50 degrees Celsius. Their clothing system, using carefully tailored caribou skins with different fur orientations, provided protection that exceeded European woolen garments. Inuit knowledge included understanding sea ice conditions, animal migration patterns, and weather signs that ensured survival in one of Earth's most challenging environments. Across all these nations, extensive trade networks moved goods across the continent. Copper from Lake Superior reached Florida, while dentalium shells from the Pacific coast reached the Great Lakes. Obsidian from British Columbia, pipestone from Minnesota, and chert from North Dakota all traveled hundreds or thousands of kilometers from their sources. These trade routes also moved ideas, technologies, and cultural practices, creating a continent-wide network of exchange. When Europeans first arrived, they encountered not wilderness, but a managed landscape. Indigenous peoples used controlled burning to maintain prairie habitats, create travel corridors, and improve hunting. They cultivated useful plants through selective harvesting and transplanting. They built fish weirs and traps that managed aquatic resources. Their populations, while difficult to estimate precisely, likely numbered between 2 and 7 million north of the Rio Grande, with sophisticated social, political, and economic systems that had evolved over thousands of years. The Clash of Worlds. Early European contact and colonization. The first sustained European contact with Canada began around 10,000 AD with Norse expeditions from Greenland. Archaeological evidence at Lanzo Meadows in Newfoundland confirms their presence, with artifacts showing they repaired ships and explored further south. They called the land Vinland, describing resources like timber and grapes that were scarce in Greenland. Their settlements were temporary, likely due to conflict with indigenous peoples they called Skraelings, and regular contact ceased after a few decades. For the next 500 years, European contact was sporadic, primarily from Basque, Portuguese, and English fishermen who visited the Grand Banks but rarely came ashore. This changed in the 16th century with the Age of Exploration. John Cabot's 1497 voyage under English commission likely reached Newfoundland or Cape Breton, reporting waters so thick with cod that sailors could lower baskets and bring them up full. This discovery would draw European fishermen for centuries, creating a seasonal industry that predated settlement. Jacques Cartier's 3 voyages, 1534 to 1542, marked France's serious entry into North America. His first contact with Iroquoian peoples at Gaspé Bay began with mutual curiosity. Cartier planted a cross claiming the land for France, while indigenous leaders paddled out to meet his ships. His subsequent voyages took him to Stadacona, Quebec City, and Hochelaga, Montreal, where he witnessed large palisaded villages and extensive agriculture. His attempts to establish permanent settlement failed, but he opened the St. Lawrence to French interest. The true foundation of New France began with Samuel de Champlain, who established Quebec City in 1608. Unlike earlier explorers, Champlain understood that permanent settlement required different strategies than seasonal resource extraction. His alliance with the Wendat, or Huron, and Algonquin nations against the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, had profound consequences, embedding French colonial interests within existing indigenous rivalries. Champlain personally joined military expeditions against the Iroquois, cementing these alliances but creating enduring enmities. The fur trade became the economic engine of New France, creating complex interdependencies. French traders, first the unlicensed coureurs de bois and later the licensed voyageurs, ventured deep into the interior. They adopted indigenous technologies like canoes, snowshoes, and moccasins, and learned to survive in the wilderness. The standard Montreal canoe measured 10 to 12 meters, could carry 3 to 4 tons of cargo, and was paddled by 8 to 10 men who could cover 14 kilometers in a day. Their paddling songs, chansons à aviron, set the rhythm for 14-hour days and became the soundtrack of the fur trade. This economic exchange facilitated cultural mixing that produced the Métis people. The children of French fur traders and indigenous women often served as cultural interpreters and intermediaries. They developed distinct identities, languages like Michif, which combined French nouns with Cree verbs, and cultural practices that blended European and indigenous traditions. The Métis would later emerge as a distinct political force with their own claims to land and self-government. Catholic missionaries, particularly the Jesuits, embarked on ambitious conversion efforts. Their relations, detailed annual reports sent to France, provide invaluable information about indigenous societies, even as the missionaries worked to transform them. Figures like John de Brébeuf lived among the Wendat for years, learning their language and customs. The Jesuit mission at Sainte-Marie among the Hurons became a remarkable cultural crossroads, though disease and conflict would eventually destroy it. The martyrdoms of several Jesuits during conflicts between Indigenous nations would later become central to Catholic hagiography in Canada. The development of New France followed a distinct pattern compared to English colonies. The seigneurial system created long, narrow riverfront lots that maximized access to the St. Lawrence, the colony's transportation backbone. Seigneurs, landlords, granted land to habitants, farmers, in return for annual payments and days of labor. While less egalitarian than New England townships, the system provided social stability and ensured orderly settlement. Society remained hierarchical, with clear distinctions between nobility, clergy, merchants, and farmers. Women played crucial roles in the early colony. The Filles des Rois, approximately 800 women sent by the French crown between 1663 and 1673, received dowries from the king if they married settlers. This program successfully boosted the population and established family life in the colony. Women like Marie de l'Incarnation established the first schools for Indigenous and French girls, while others became successful merchants and landowners in their own right. While New France expanded, other European powers established footholds. The English founded settlements in Newfoundland, and following Henry Hudson's explorations, the Hudson's Bay Company received its charter in 1670, claiming the vast Rupert Land drainage basin. This set the stage for imperial competition, not just between European powers, but between different colonial models. The French emphasis on trade alliances and continental reach versus the English focus on agricultural settlement and coastal control. The growing European presence had catastrophic consequences for Indigenous populations. Epidemics of smallpox, measles, and other diseases to which they had no immunity devastated communities. Between 1334 and 1340, smallpox killed approximately 50% of the Wyandot population. Similar devastation occurred across the continent, with some regions experiencing mortality rates exceeding 90%. This demographic collapse, combined with economic transformation and warfare exacerbated by European alliances, fundamentally altered Indigenous societies long before direct European political control was established.
As we consider these early encounters between worlds, we're confronted with both the tragedy of collision and the resilience of human spirit. The demographic catastrophe that swept Indigenous communities, the cultural misunderstandings that led to conflict, the fundamental reshaping of economies and societies, these remain difficult chapters in our shared history. Yet within this collision, we also see the beginnings of what would become Canada. The complex relationship between French, English, the enduring presence of Indigenous nations, the pattern of intercultural negotiation that would characterize Canadian development. The fur trade alliances, however imperfect, established that Europeans needed Indigenous knowledge to survive in this land. The Métis emergence showed that new cultures could be born from encounter. These early years established patterns that would echo through Canadian history. The tension between resource extraction and settlement, between imperial ambition and local reality, between assimilation and accommodation. As we continue our journey, we'll see how these patterns evolved, how conflicts were resolved or exacerbated, and how the complex relationships established in these early years would shape the nation to come.
The imperial struggle, New France, British conquest, and its aftermath. The 18th century witnessed the escalation of imperial rivalry between France and Britain into a global struggle that would determine North America's fate. The series of European conflicts, the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748, and the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, all had North American theaters where French and British interests collided. New France in its final decades was a society of striking contrasts. On one hand, it had achieved remarkable continental reach. Explorers and traders had established a network of posts from Louisbourg on the Atlantic to Detroit in the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi to New Orleans, and across the prairies to the Rocky Mountains. The population grew through natural increase, developing a distinctive Canadian identity separate from metropolitan France. The birth rate was astonishing. Families with 10 to 12 children were common, creating a population that grew from 15,000 in 1700 to 70,000 by 1760, despite limited immigration. Yet, the colony suffered from fundamental weaknesses. Its population remained small compared to over 1.5 million in the British colonies. Its economy was overwhelmingly dependent on the fur trade, with limited agricultural diversification or manufacturing. Most critically, it received inconsistent support from France, which often saw New France as less important than European interests or Caribbean sugar islands. The final conflict began in the Ohio Valley, where competing French and British claims overlapped. The French built a series of forts to secure their claims, while British colonists from Virginia pressed westward. The initial years of the 7 Years' War went surprisingly well for New France. The French commander, the Marquis de Montcalm, achieved significant victories, including the capture of Fort Oswego and Fort William Henry. At the Battle of the Monongahela in 1755, French and Indigenous forces decimated General Braddock's British army, with a young George Washington barely escaping with his life. However, British naval superiority and greater resources gradually turned the tide. The capture of Louisburg in 1758 opened the St. Lawrence to British invasion. The decisive moment came on September 13, 1759, on the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec City. In a daring night maneuver, British General James Wolfe scaled the cliffs and deployed his army on the plains. The battle lasted only 15 minutes, but both commanders, Wolfe and Montcalm, were mortally wounded. After a difficult winter, the British captured Montreal in 1760, effectively ending New France. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 formalized the transfer of New France to Britain, but the challenges of governing 70,000 French-speaking Catholics soon became apparent. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 attempted to establish British institutions and attract Protestant settlement. It also created a vast Indian territory west of the Appalachians, theoretically protecting indigenous lands from colonial expansion, a provision largely ignored by American colonists. The proclamation's provisions for Quebec proved unworkable, leading to its replacement by the Quebec Act of 1774. This remarkable legislation represented a pragmatic reversal, restoring French civil law, guaranteeing Catholic religious freedom, and expanding Quebec's territory into the Ohio Valley. While it successfully secured Quebec's loyalty during the American Revolution, it infuriated American colonists, who listed it as one of their intolerable acts justifying rebellion. The American Revolution, 1775 to 1783, had profound consequences for Canada. The Continental Army's invasion of Quebec in 1775 to 1776, despite early success at capturing Montreal, ultimately failed at Quebec City. The defense was led by Governor Sir Guy Carleton and French-Canadian militia, showing the success of the Quebec Act in securing Canadian loyalty. More significantly, the migration of approximately 40,000 United Empire Loyalists northward transformed British North America. These Loyalists, both white and black, including those who gained freedom by fighting for Britain, established new settlements in Nova Scotia, Quebec, and the wilderness that would become New Brunswick and Ontario. Their arrival created a counterweight to the French-Canadian population and introduced different political expectations. The Loyalist migration necessitated new political arrangements, leading to the Constitutional Act of 1791. This legislation divided Quebec into predominantly English-speaking Upper Canada and predominantly French-speaking Lower Canada. Each received an elected legislative assembly, though real power remained with appointed governors and executive councils. This arrangement established the political framework that would govern British North America until the rebellions of 1838, to 1839. The early 19th century saw the development of distinct political cultures in both Canadas. In Upper Canada, the Family Compact, a small, interlinked elite of officials, merchants, and Anglican clergy, dominated political life. In Lower Canada, the Chateau clique of British merchants and their French-Canadian allies exercised disproportionate influence. In both colonies, reform movements emerged, demanding greater democratic accountability and challenging entrenched privilege.
Building a distinct society, reform, rebellion, and responsible government. The period from 1815 to 1867 witnessed the gradual emergence of distinctly Canadian political institutions and the achievement of self-government. The War of 1812, while ultimately a stalemate, fostered a sense of British North American identity distinct from both Britain and the United States. Canadian militia, British regulars, and Indigenous allies had successfully defended against American invasion, creating heroes like Isaac Brock and Laura Secord, and myths of militia valor that would endure for generations. The post-war period saw growing discontent with the colonial oligarchies that dominated both Canadas. In Upper Canada, the Family Compact controlled patronage and land policy, favoring Anglican establishment and limiting opportunities for other Protestant denominations. The Anglican Church's monopoly on clergy reserves, 1/7 of all public lands, hampered agricultural development and offended other denominations. In Lower Canada, the Chateau clique of British merchants dominated the economy, while the French-Canadian professional class found itself excluded from real power, despite controlling the elected assembly. The decline of the fur trade and the rise of timber and wheat exports shifted economic power toward British merchants, creating conflict with French-Canadian habitant farmers who feared losing their traditional way of life. The growing discontent found voice in reform movements. In Upper Canada, figures like William Lyon Mackenzie used his newspaper, The Colonial Advocate, to attack privilege and demand responsible government, the principle that the executive should be accountable to the elected assembly rather than to the crown. In Lower Canada, Louis-Joseph Papineau and the Parti Patriote articulated French-Canadian nationalist concerns while also advocating for democratic reforms. These tensions exploded in the rebellions of 1837-1838. In Lower Canada, protests escalated into armed conflict at Saint-Denis, Saint-Charles, and Saint-Eustache. The Patriots achieved a surprising victory at Saint-Denis, but were crushed at Saint-Charles and Saint-Eustache. In Upper Canada, Mackenzie gathered supporters at Montgomery's Tavern north of Toronto, but his makeshift rebellion was quickly dispersed by Loyalist forces. Both rebellions were militarily unsuccessful and brutally suppressed, but they forced British authorities to confront the colony's governance problems. Britain dispatched Lord Durham as Governor-General and sent him to investigate the causes of the unrest. His 1839 report on the affairs of British North America contained two seminal recommendations: the union of Upper and Lower Canada to assimilate French Canadians, and the implementation of responsible government. The first recommendation, steeped in ethnic prejudice, was implemented through the Act of Union, 1840, which created the United Province of Canada. The second recommendation, though initially rejected, became the central goal of Canadian reformers. The period from 1841 to 1867 witnessed the gradual implementation of responsible government through what historian J.M.S. Careless called the politics of moderation. Reformers like Robert Baldwin in Canada West, formerly Upper Canada, and Louis-Hippolyte Lafontaine in Canada East, formerly Lower Canada, formed a remarkable alliance that transcended linguistic divisions. Their collaboration demonstrated that French and English politicians could work together for common political goals. When Lafontaine's government faced opposition in Montreal, Baldwin offered him a seat in Canada West, and when Baldwin needed support, Lafontaine returned the favor. The achievement of responsible government in 1848 when Governor-General Lord Elgin accepted the principle that he must appoint ministers who commanded the Assembly's confidence, marked a quiet constitutional revolution. Unlike the United States, which achieved independence through revolution, or Australia, which remained longer under British control, Canada developed this crucial democratic principle through political evolution. This period also saw significant economic and social transformation. The British move toward free trade ended colonial preference, forcing British North American colonies to develop more integrated economies. Railway construction, beginning with the Champlain and St. Lawrence Railroad in 1836, accelerated throughout the 1840s and 1850s. The Grand Trunk Railway, completed in the 1850s, connected Montreal to Toronto and eventually to Portland, Maine, physically binding regions together. The Reciprocity Treaty, 1854 to 1866, provided temporary economic relief but also highlighted British North America's vulnerability to American policy shifts. When the treaty was abrogated after the Civil War, it created economic pressure for the colonies to seek new trading relationships with each other. By the 1860s, the United Province of Canada had reached political stalemate. The legislative union proved unworkable as Canada East and Canada West developed different priorities and found themselves unable to form stable governments. The double majority principle, that legislation affecting one section required support from that section's representatives, created frequent deadlocks. External pressures mounted. The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, revealed the potential military threat from the United States, particularly after Confederate agents based in Canada launched raids across the border. The Fenian Raids, 1866 to 1871, launched by Irish-American veterans of the Civil War, further highlighted vulnerability. Meanwhile, British enthusiasm for defending distant colonies waned, as free trade reduced the economic benefits of empire. These political and geopolitical pressures converged to make broader union not just desirable, but necessary. The stage was set for Confederation, a bold project that would transform separate colonies into a single nation.
In the peaceful achievement of responsible government, we see the emerging character of the Canadian political tradition. Evolutionary rather than revolutionary, pragmatic rather than ideological, built on coalition and compromise rather than confrontation. The Baldwin-LaFontaine alliance demonstrated that French and English political leaders could find common cause, establishing a precedent that would make Confederation possible. Yet this period also revealed enduring tensions between French and English, between elected assemblies and appointed authorities, between regional interests and central power. The political stalemate of the 1860s showed that the United Province of Canada had become ungovernable, requiring a new constitutional arrangement. The achievement of self-government through political means rather than revolution created a distinctive Canadian approach to change, cautious, incremental, and focused on finding workable compromises. This approach would characterize not only the move toward Confederation, but many subsequent developments in Canadian history, from the building of the welfare state to the management of linguistic and regional diversity. As we turn to Confederation, we see how these political lessons were applied on a grander scale, creating a federal system that would attempt to balance competing regional, linguistic, and economic interests within a single national framework.
Confederation, the birth of a dominion. The road to Confederation began not with grand national vision, but with practical political problems. By the early 1860s, the United Province of Canada was politically paralyzed. The legislative union required double majorities, support from both Canada East and Canada West, for governments to function, leading to frequent deadlocks and short-lived administrations. In the period from 1861 to 1864, there were 3 general elections and 4 different governments. Meanwhile, the maritime colonies, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Prince Edward Island, contemplated their own union to address economic challenges and improve their bargaining position with the United States. They scheduled a conference in Charlottetown for September 1864 to discuss maritime union. The Canadian coalition government, comprising former rivals John A. Macdonald, George Etienne Cartier, and George Brown, saw an opportunity. They asked to attend the Charlottetown Conference to propose a broader union. The maritime delegates agreed, and what began as a discussion of maritime union transformed into negotiations for British North American Federation. The Charlottetown Conference, September 1 to 9, 1864, was remarkably successful. The Canadian delegates, particularly Macdonald and Cartier, made persuasive arguments for union. They emphasized the economic benefits of a larger common market, the improved bargaining power in negotiations with the United States, and the security advantages of collective defense. The social events, particularly the champagne reception aboard the Canadian steamer Queen Victoria, helped build personal relationships among the delegates. The subsequent Quebec Conference, October 10 to 27, 1864, involved more detailed negotiations. 33 delegates from 5 colonies, Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland, debated the structure of the proposed federation. The Quebec resolutions, 72 in total, outlined the framework for confederation. The delegates represented remarkably diverse perspectives. John A. Macdonald favored a strong central government, fearing the decentralization that had contributed to the American Civil War. Georges Etienne Cartier insisted on protection for French-Canadian distinctiveness within a federal framework. Maritime delegates, like Charles Tupper of Nova Scotia and Samuel Leonard Tilley of New Brunswick, sought guarantees for regional economic development. The resulting compromise created a federal system with significant powers allocated to the central government, but with important jurisdictional areas reserved for provinces. The division of powers outlined in what would become Sections 91 and 92 of the British North America Act reflected these compromises. The federal government received authority over matters of national concern: trade, defense, criminal law, and banking. Provincial jurisdictions included education, property, civil rights, and generally matters of a merely local or private nature. This division, particularly federal responsibility for Indians and lands reserved for the Indians, would have profound consequences for Indigenous peoples. The name Dominion was suggested by Tilley from Psalm 72. He shall have dominion also from sea to sea. This reflected the desire for a designation equal to kingdom, but less likely to antagonize the United States. The term also acknowledged Canada's continuing ties to Britain while asserting a distinct status. Ratification proved challenging. In the province of Canada, the coalition government easily passed the resolutions. In the Maritimes, however, opposition was strong. Anti-Confederation sentiment was particularly powerful in Nova Scotia, where Howe led a movement for repeal. In New Brunswick, an election fought on Confederation returned an anti-Confederation government, though it later reversed position under pressure from the British government. The British government strongly supported Confederation, seeing it as a way to reduce the cost and responsibility of defending the North American colonies. The British North America Act received royal assent on March 29, 1867, and came into force on July 1, 1867, creating the Dominion of Canada with 4 provinces: Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. The early Dominion faced immediate challenges. Anti-Confederation sentiment remained strong in Nova Scotia, where Howe continued to demand repeal. The new government had to incorporate the vast territories of the Hudson's Bay Company, which had purchased in 1869 for £300,000. This transaction, negotiated without consultation with the Red River Colony's inhabitants, particularly the Métis, sparked resistance. The Red River Resistance, 1869 to 1870, under Louis Riel, forced the Canadian government to negotiate. The resulting Manitoba Act 1870 created Canada's 5th province with guarantees for French language rights and Protestant and Catholic separate schools. However, the execution of Thomas Scott, an Ontario Orangeman by Riel's provisional government, created lasting English-Canadian hostility toward Riel and complicated French-English relations. British Columbia joined Confederation in 1871, persuaded by promises of a transcontinental railway within 10 years. Prince Edward Island followed in 1873, largely due to railway debt. These expansions fulfilled the sea-to-sea vision but created enormous financial and engineering challenges. The Macdonald government's determination to build the Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, despite the Pacific Scandal, which revealed the government had accepted campaign donations from the railway's backers, led to its temporary defeat in 1873. The national policy, introduced after Macdonald's return to power in 1878, established the conservative vision for Canada's development: protective tariffs to shield Canadian industry, accelerated immigration to settle the West, and completion of the Transcontinental Railway. This policy framework would dominate Canadian politics for decades and shape the country's economic development, though its benefits were unevenly distributed and its implementation often came at the expense of Indigenous peoples and Western farmers.
Building the transcontinental nation, railways, resistance, and Western settlement. The last 3 decades of the 19th century witnessed the physical construction of the transcontinental nation envisioned at Confederation. The Canadian Pacific Railway, CPR, became the project that would either make or break the young country. Its completion required extraordinary engineering feats through the Canadian Shield north of Lake Superior and across the formidable Rocky Mountains, all while navigating financial crises and political opposition. The CPR's construction, under the driven leadership of William Cornelius Van Horne, represented one of the 19th century's great industrial achievements. Construction through the Canadian Shield north of Lake Superior was particularly challenging. Workers had to blast through Precambrian rock and build bridges across numerous rivers and gulls. In the Rockies, the route through Kicking Horse Pass required a descent so steep that special braking techniques were needed until the spiral tunnels could be completed years later. The national dream came at tremendous human cost. Thousands of Chinese migrant workers, paid less than their white counterparts and assigned the most dangerous tasks, died building the railway through the Fraser Canyon. They worked with dynamite in unstable rock faces, risked landslides, and died from disease and accidents. Their suffering and contributions would long be overlooked in official histories celebrating the railway's completion in 1885 at Craigellachie, British Columbia, where Donald Smith drove the last spike. The railway's completion had immediate geopolitical consequences. Even before the last spike was driven, the CPR enabled the government to rapidly deploy troops to suppress the Northwest resistance of 1885. This conflict, led once again by Louis Riel, emerged from similar grievances as the Red River resistance, the threat to Métis land rights and way of life from incoming settlement. The Métis had sent numerous petitions to Ottawa, detailing their concerns about land surveys, the disappearance of the bison, and the lack of representation, but received little response. The defeat of Métis and First Nations forces at Batoche and the subsequent execution of Riel created a lasting political rift. In Quebec, Riel was viewed as a French Catholic martyr, and his execution galvanized French-Canadian nationalism. In English Canada, he was generally considered a traitor. The divergence in perception revealed the continuing linguistic and cultural divisions within the country. The late 19th century also witnessed the implementation of the Indian Act 1876 and the establishment of the residential school system, both aimed at assimilating Indigenous peoples.
The Indian Act consolidated previous legislation and created a comprehensive system of control over First Nations lives. It defined who was an Indian, established the reserve system, and created the pass system that restricted movement off reserves. The residential schools, operated primarily by churches but funded by the federal government, sought to kill the Indian in the child by removing children from their families, forbidding Indigenous languages and cultural practices, and imposing Euro-Canadian education. The first schools had opened earlier, but the system expanded significantly after 1880. The conditions were often horrific. Poor nutrition, inadequate housing, physical and sexual abuse, and disease were widespread. The system would cause intergenerational trauma and cultural loss, whose consequences continued to be addressed today. With the railway complete and Indigenous resistance suppressed, the government aggressively promoted immigration to settle the West. Clifford Sifton, Minister of the Interior from 1896 to 1905, famously sought stalwart peasants in sheepskin coats from Eastern Europe, believing them better suited to prairie farming than British urbanites. Immigration stations like the one at Grosse Ile for arrivals from Europe and later Pier 21 in Halifax processed millions of newcomers, though policies remained discriminatory against Asian and other non-white immigrants. The settlement process transformed the prairie ecosystem. The Dominion Lands Act offered 160-acre homesteads for a $10 registration fee, provided settlers proved up the land by building a dwelling and cultivating a certain portion within 3 years. This policy, modeled on the Homestead Act, encouraged the conversion of native grassland to wheat fields on an unprecedented scale. New wheat varieties like Marquis, developed by Charles Saunders at the Central Experimental Farm in Ottawa, were better adapted to the short growing season, making the prairies one of the world's great breadbaskets. Urban centers grew rapidly. Winnipeg became the gateway to the West, its population exploding from 241 in 1871 to over 150,000 by 1911. Its location at the confluence of the Red and Assiniboine Rivers made it the natural distribution point for Western settlement. Vancouver rose from the ashes of the 1886 fire to become the Pacific terminus, its economy initially based on lumber, but soon diversifying into shipping and services. Meanwhile, urban cities in central Canada, particularly Montreal and Toronto, expanded as manufacturing centers protected by the national policy's tariffs. Montreal became the financial and transportation hub of the country, while Toronto grew as a center of industry and commerce. The different economic bases, resource extraction in the West, manufacturing in central Canada, and fishing and lumber in the Maritimes, created regional economic interests that would shape Canadian politics for generations. Not all Canadians shared equally in this prosperity. Industrial workers faced long hours, low pay, and dangerous conditions. The 1872 Toronto printers' strike led to the legalization of trade unions, but working conditions remained difficult. Women remained legally and politically marginalized, though they were beginning to organize suffragette movements, particularly in Western Canada, where frontier conditions created slightly more egalitarian social relations. By the turn of the century, Canada was a country of striking contrasts, a rapidly industrializing East and an agricultural West, growing cities and depopulating countryside, spectacular economic growth, and profound social inequality. These tensions would define the challenges of the new century as Canada emerged on the world stage.
Trial and transformation. The World Wars and the modern nation. The 20th century witnessed Canada's traumatic emergence from colonial status to independent nationhood, a transformation accelerated by 2 world wars. When Britain declared war on Germany in August 1914, Canada, as part of the British Empire, was automatically at war.
But the country that entered the conflict was fundamentally different from the one that would emerge 4 years later. The First World War represented a national trial on an unprecedented scale. Over 600,000 Canadians served from a population of under 8 million, and approximately 60,000 were killed, with another 173,000 wounded. The Canadian Corps evolved from an inexperienced collection of battalions into one of the most effective fighting forces on the Western Front. Their reputation was cemented at battles like Ypres, where they faced the first poison gas attacks, the Somme, Vimy Ridge, and Passchendaele. The Battle of Vimy Ridge in April 1917 became particularly embedded in Canadian mythology. For the first time, all 4 Canadian divisions fought together, capturing a position that had previously resisted French and British attacks. The meticulously planned assault, emphasizing thorough preparation and individual initiative, came to symbolize Canada's emergence from Britain's shadow, though at the cost of 10,000 casualties in 3 days. The war's impact extended beyond the battlefield. The home front witnessed unprecedented government intervention in the economy through organizations like the Imperial Munitions Board, which coordinated war production. The expansion of women's employment in factories and offices accelerated social change. The war also exposed deep divisions, particularly during the 1917 conscription crisis. When Prime Minister Robert Borden's government imposed mandatory military service to meet troop commitments, it sparked opposition in Quebec, where many felt no loyalty to France or Britain and saw the war as an imperial conflict. Farmers opposed losing their sons as laborers, and labor activists saw conscription as class legislation. The election of 1917 fought largely on the conscription issue, bitterly divided the country along linguistic and regional lines. The Military Voters Act and Wartime Elections Act, which gave votes to soldiers, including women nurses and female relatives of soldiers, while disenfranchising conscientious objectors and immigrants from enemy countries, ensured Borden's victory but poisoned French-English relations. The interwar years saw Canada assert its growing independence on the world stage. Canada signed the Treaty of Versailles independently and joined the League of Nations separately from Britain. The 1926 Balfour Declaration recognized Canada as an autonomous community within the British Empire, a status formalized by the 1931 Statute of Westminster. This legislation granted Canada full legal freedom, though the power to amend its constitution remained in Britain until 1982. Domestically, the 1920s brought economic growth and cultural development, though these developments were unevenly distributed. The 1919 Winnipeg General Strike, which saw 30,000 workers walk off their jobs and the federal government respond with violence and arrests, revealed deep class tensions. The Persons Case, decided in 1929, established that women were persons under the law and could be appointed to the Senate, though full suffrage would take longer. The Great Depression of the 1930s hit Canada with particular severity. Unemployment reached approximately 30%, and traditional responses proved inadequate. The drought on the prairies, combined with falling wheat prices, created devastating conditions. Relief camps for single unemployed men became centers of discontent, culminating in the On to Ottawa Track of 1935 and the Regina Riot. The failure of established political parties to address the crisis gave rise to new movements: the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF on the left, Social Credit in Alberta, and the Union Nationale in Quebec. These developments reflected a growing demand for greater government intervention in the economy and society. The Second World War marked another stage in Canada's evolution. Unlike 1914, Canada made its own declaration of war 1 week after Britain in September 1939. The war effort was more comprehensively managed than in the previous conflict, with programs like the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan making Canada the aerodrome of democracy. Over 130,000 aircrew from across the Commonwealth trained in Canada. Canadian forces played significant roles in the disastrous Dieppe raid, where 907 Canadians were killed in a single day, the Italian campaign, the D-Day landings, where the 3rd Canadian Division stormed Juno Beach, and the liberation of Northwest Europe. The Battle of the Atlantic was fought largely by Canadian ships and airmen protecting convoys from German U-boats. The war transformed Canada's economy and society. Industrial production diversified beyond resource extraction. Canada produced everything from military vehicles to synthetic rubber. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, though many were pushed out after the war. The federal government's role expanded dramatically through agencies like the Wartime Price and Trade Board. The war also exposed ongoing tensions, particularly regarding conscription. Prime Minister Mackenzie King promised not necessarily conscription, but conscription if necessary, but was eventually forced to implement limited conscription in 1944, again causing division between English and French Canada. Post-war Canada emerged as a significant middle power. Canada participated in the founding of the United Nations and contributed Lester Pearson, who would later win the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in resolving the Suez Crisis and pioneering peacekeeping. Canada joined NATO in 1949, committing to collective security. The domestic scene witnessed the construction of the welfare state. Family allowances, or baby bonuses, introduced in 1945, represented the first universal social program. Unemployment insurance was federalized in 1940, and hospital insurance would follow in the 1950s. The economic boom of the 1950s and 1960s brought unprecedented prosperity, suburbanization, and the expansion of higher education. However, these developments occurred alongside ongoing challenges. The quiet alienation of Quebec, where traditional society was rapidly transforming during the Quiet Revolution, would soon erupt into constitutional crisis. The continued marginalization of Indigenous peoples, including the extension of the residential school system and the forced relocation of Inuit communities, created injustices that would take decades to address. These tensions would define the dramatic changes of the late 20th century. Modern challenges: Constitution, Quebec, and multiculturalism. The period from the 1960s to the present has witnessed Canada's continuing evolution as it grappled with fundamental questions of identity, governance, and its place in the world. The Quiet Revolution in Quebec during the 1960s transformed the province from a conservative, church-dominated society into a modern secular state. In what became known as Maîtres chez nous, masters in our own house, the Quebec government took control of education and social services from the Catholic Church, nationalized hydroelectricity, and pursued an assertive cultural and economic policy. This awakening of French-Canadian nationalism found political expression in the Parti Québécois, founded in 1968 by René Lévesque, and the Front de Libération du Québec, FLQ, whose terrorist activities culminated in the October Crisis of 1970. The FLQ's kidnapping of British diplomat James Cross and Quebec Labour Minister Pierre Laporte, who was later murdered, prompted Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau to invoke the War Measures Act, the first peacetime use of these emergency powers. The crisis exposed deep tensions about security, civil liberties, and Quebec's place in Canada. The federal government under Trudeau responded both with confrontation and accommodation. The Official Languages Act, 1969, made Canada officially bilingual, requiring federal services in both languages where numbers warranted. Trudeau's central project became patriating the Constitution with an amending formula and a Charter of Rights, an effort that culminated in the Constitution Act of 1982. The patriation process was contentious. The Kitchen Accord between Federal Justice Minister Jean Chrétien and Ontario and Saskatchewan Attorneys General produced a compromise that allowed patriation to proceed, but without Quebec's consent. The resulting Constitution Act included the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which fundamentally transformed Canadian society by shifting power from legislatures to courts and providing new tools for groups seeking social change. The Charter's impact was immediate and profound. Women's organizations used the equality rights provisions to challenge discriminatory laws. Indigenous peoples used it to advance land claims and self-government rights. Official language minorities used it to protect education rights. The Charter became what some called a civil religion, a shared set of values around which Canadians could unite regardless of other differences. However, Quebec never signed the Constitution, creating a lingering constitutional crisis that would dominate Canadian politics for the next 2 decades. The failed Meech Lake, 1987, and Charlottetown, 1992 accords attempted to address Quebec's concerns by recognizing it as a distinct society and devolving additional powers to all provinces. Their failure, for different reasons in each case, led to the 1995 Quebec referendum on sovereignty. The 1995 referendum saw the Federalist side win by a razor-thin margin of 50.58% to 49.42%. The near-death experience forced a recognition that Quebec's place in Canada required ongoing negotiation. The federal government passed the Clarity Act 2000, outlining the terms for any future sovereignty referendum, while Quebec passed its own legislation asserting its right to self-determination. Parallel to these constitutional dramas, Canada was transforming its immigration policies and national identity. The 1967 points system removed racial and ethnic criteria for immigration, focusing instead on education, skills, and language ability. In 1971, Canada became the first country to adopt an official policy of multiculturalism, rejecting the American melting pot in favor of a mosaic that encouraged cultural retention within a shared civic framework. This transformation was particularly visible in major cities. Toronto became one of the world's most diverse urban centers, with half its population born outside Canada. Vancouver saw significant immigration from Asia, particularly Hong Kong, before the 1997 handover. The 1982 Charter's equality rights provisions, combined with the 1988 Canadian Multiculturalism Act, created a legal framework supporting diversity, though not without ongoing challenges regarding integration, religious accommodation, and systemic discrimination. Economic changes were equally profound. The 1989 Canada-US Free Trade Agreement, extended to Mexico in the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, reoriented Canada's economy further toward the United States. The 1990s brought fiscal crises that led to dramatic spending cuts, particularly in transfers to provinces, and the introduction of the Goods and Services Tax, GST. The near-dead experience of 1995 forced the Chrétien government to make drastic cuts to eliminate the deficit, creating both fiscal stability and social strain. The new millennium has seen Canada continue to grapple with its past while navigating global challenges. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, 1996, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 2008-2015, confronted the legacy of residential schools and other colonial policies. Prime Minister Stephen Harper's formal apology in 2008 began a difficult process of reconciliation that continues today, including the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Climate change has emerged as a critical policy challenge, particularly for resource-dependent regions. The development of the oil sands made Canada an energy superpower, but created environmental tensions. The debate over pipelines like Keystone XL and Trans Mountain revealed the difficulty of balancing economic development, environmental protection, and Indigenous rights. In the 21st century, Canada faces the ongoing task of balancing regional, linguistic, and cultural diversity with national cohesion. The relationship with an increasingly unpredictable United States requires careful management. Canada's role in a changing global order, whether through organizations like the G7, NATO, or new trade agreements like the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement with the European Union, continues to evolve. Through all these changes, Canada has maintained its distinctive approach to governance, pragmatic, incremental, and focused on finding workable compromises. The country that entered the 21st century was vastly different from the one that celebrated its centennial in 1967. Yet it continued to grapple with many of the same fundamental questions about identity, unity, and its place in the world.
As our journey through Canada's history draws to a close, we stand at the edge of the present moment, looking back on a path marked by both achievement and adversity. From the ancient civilizations that first called this land home to the complex multicultural society of today, Canada's story is one of continuous becoming, a work perpetually in progress. We've witnessed the sophistication of Indigenous societies that thrived from millennia, developing profound relationships with the land that sustained them. We've seen the collision of European empires, the birth of a nation through negotiation rather than revolution, the traumatic forging of identity in world wars, and the ongoing work of building a society that embraces diversity while seeking common ground. Canada's path has rarely been straightforward. It contains both triumph and tragedy. The visionary leadership of figures like Macdonald, Laurier, and Pearson, alongside the injustice of residential schools, the Chinese head tax, and the internment of Japanese Canadians, the hanging of Louis Riel, the conscription crises, the October crisis, the Quebec referendums. These remain difficult chapters in our national story, reminders that building a country spanning a continent and encompassing profound differences is never easy. Yet through it all, Canada has demonstrated a remarkable capacity for self-correction, for adaptation, for finding ways to accommodate difference, the achievement of responsible government, Confederation, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the embrace of multiculturalism. These milestones represent a continuing effort to create a society that balances freedom with responsibility, diversity with unity, regional identity with national purpose. As we look to the future, the challenges are no less daunting. Climate change threatens our environment and economy. Reconciliation with Indigenous peoples remains unfinished work. Global instability tests our international relationships. Economic transformation creates both opportunity and insecurity. Yet, if history is a guide, Canada's greatest trait has always been its ability to evolve, to reinvent itself while staying true to the fundamental values of peace, order, and good government that have guided it from the beginning. The Canadian experiment continues, a northern project that still captures the world's imagination. From the Atlantic's rugged shores to the Pacific's misty coasts to the Arctic's midnight sun, the story of this great land is still being written. Its next chapters will be shaped by how we address the challenges of our time, how we learn from the lessons of our past, and how we continue the work of building a society where everyone has the opportunity to flourish. The birth and rise of Canada are not a completing story, but an ongoing journey, a testament to the possibility of creating a nation not from common ethnicity or shared evolution, but from a contained conversation about what it means to live together in this demanding, beautiful, and endlessly fascinating land.